Hello, everyone. Welcome along. Thank you for joining. I always want to say this evening, but I know that obviously people are joining from different places. So whatever time of day it is for you, thank you for joining along. Hopefully this is going to be a fabulous session. I'm going to wait for a minute or so and just see if anybody else jumps in. But we're going to go for about an hour, including time for people to ask questions. I've tried to come from a pretty broad stance and cover what I would assume most people will be thinking when we talk about menopause. But obviously, if I don't cover anything, feel free to chuck something in the chat box and I will happily answer any questions when we get to the end. If I am talking complete nonsense or you get really confused at any point within the session, whack your hand up and I will go back and I will hopefully go over it again in a slightly clearer manner. But fingers crossed that I managed to be concise, succinct, and non-confusing. Right, it is officially 6:01, so we are diving in. Right, okay, so the menopause. What a wonderful thing. We obviously have the perimenopause, which is the transition in towards the menopause, and we have the menopause itself, and we have the post-menopausal situation, ongoing life thing. If we look at that whole process as purely being related to reproductive hormone changes, we've totally missed the mark. That's my opinion, but I think that if we try and just call it a transition that's just about estrogen and progesterone levels falling and that kind of stuff, we have done all womankind a total disservice. I also tend to refer to it as a transformation rather than a transition. It is definitely a journey, but a woman is literally going from being one thing into being another. And although we are very much not defined by our ability to reproduce, it's something that defines us as female humans, isn't it? And whether you've chosen to have children or not, I think it's still a process of mental evolution as well as physical evolution. And it can really be for some women that they feel totally not at home anymore in their body throughout the period of like peri and menopausal transition. I will say this as well. I am trying to come from, like I say, as broad an angle as possible. There will be situations where the menopause is very different for some women. So it is always going to be individual. Some women will have no issues whatsoever. And some women might have a very sudden menopause, whether that's due to some kind of treatment intervention, perhaps they had a hysterectomy or they're going through some kind of chemotherapy or that kind of thing, or perhaps primary ovarian failure. Like there are lots of different things that can suddenly put somebody in that situation. But hopefully, unless there's any specific reason why what I'm talking about in a certain situation would not be applicable to everyone, assume that it's all adaptable to you as an individual or to somebody else as an individual. And yes, if there's any reason that it wouldn't be appropriate for somebody, then I will highlight that. And if you are unsure, of course, ask questions. So I thought we'd start off with the basic bits, which is kind of an overall dietary intervention perspective, because the main thing that I think that people don't realize is quite how internally stressful the menopause is. So what you are seeing is an interruption of menstrual cycling because overall your progesterone and estrogen levels are falling. And the menstrual cycle is dictated by beautiful sort of wave-like movements of your estrogen progesterone levels over the course of a month or whatever length your cycle is, whether that's 27 days or 38 days or whatever it is. So what women will start to see when they start entering the perimenopause is that their cycles might become irregular. They might change in terms of the actual length of bleeding. They might get other symptoms around it. The intensity of bleeding might change, tends to just become a little bit erratic. And if you imagine that previous to this, you've got this going on with your hormone levels over the course of the month, and then all of a sudden you get that, which is kind of like a toddler with a crayon scribbling on a wall, that's really stressful for your body. So one of the main things that we have to look at is actually managing the stress response, because a lot of, not a lot of hormonal symptoms, a lot of menopausal symptoms are actually related to the fact that internal stress from hormone fluctuations creates more adrenaline and more cortisol circulating within the body, which in turn raises insulin levels. So one of the main things that we do when we look at our diet is we think, how do we sort of mitigate that impact on ourselves with the way that we're choosing to eat, the way that we're choosing to exercise, all of that kind of stuff. Because if you've got a certain amount of capacity for burden and you've been doing something all your life one way, and then all of a sudden you have to do all of those things, but with a huge weight on your back, it's going to suddenly be very difficult to cope with all of that. So what we're thinking is, right, well, we've asked our body to deal with this transitional period, so we're going to be as kind as we can in terms of balancing everything out. So very simple, I start adjusting people's macronutrient proportions, which basically means when you're eating your meals, you prioritize protein. You get about 25 to 35 grams of protein per meal as an absolute standard. You do a medium carbohydrate diet. So that's probably having about a cupped handful of carbohydrates, and they always need to be very complex ones. So you want something like pearl barley, or like a really good kind of like lentil and brown rice mix, or you want some, I don't know, boiled white potatoes that you've left to go cold in the fridge for about 3 days, specifically that, because it means that the carbohydrate content in them evolves and becomes more resistant starch base. It doesn't impact your blood glucose so much. And then you go for some unsaturated fats, and you go for a relatively small quantity. They need to be present, but compared to where you might put yourself otherwise, the reason that you do that is insulin levels are higher. You're naturally in a slightly higher storage situation when it comes to the energy that you're eating as calories per day. So fats are very important for triggering satiety. So like I said, they have to be present. But if you know that your body is just slightly eking on the side of wanting to store more, the comparative calories that you get from protein and carbs is 4 calories per gram of both of those sets of foods, and it's 9 calories per gram of fats. Now, if you were to go completely low fat, terrible idea, really bad idea. Don't do it, because you'll never feel full and you'll snack and you'll graze, and that's the worst thing you can do for your blood sugar regulation and the stress response situation. But if you add in a small, like a conservative portion of things like olives, a little bit of olive oil, a bit of avocado, but you prioritize things like your protein, your non-starchy veg, and your complex carbohydrates, you'll get full satiety, and you'll also make sure that you aren't shuttling too much energy into storage, which would then lead to weight gain, which is one of the main things that women dislike about the fact that they're going through the menopause. Because all of a sudden, with not changing anything about what they're doing, they can find that the central little muffin top starts to creep in. And I'm going to touch on that specifically a little bit later on, because I know it's a big one, but this is one of the main things that we do with dietary alterations. The reason I say unsaturated fats specifically is because when we look at the way that fats sort of behave in the body, our cell membranes are made up of the majority of fats that we eat in our diets. And we all need a little bit of saturated fat, but if you're having really good quality red meat and all that kind of stuff, you'll get little bits kind of eking in. But what you want to try and choose is more of your unsaturated fats, so that your cell membranes maintain their flexibility, because this idea of stress response impacting blood sugar regulation also impacts cell communication. And I know that I might be confusing some people, but basically, if you had the choice between hard cheese, butter, and I don't know, like a big fatty steak, then choose oily fish, olive oil, and avocados, nuts and seeds. That's the amount that you need to take from that. The other thing is to go for as many colors as possible, because again, the idea of stress on the body is that it deprives you of, well, doesn't deprive you of, it uses up your antioxidants more quickly. And that then means that there are less to go around for other things, and every colorful pigment in a natural food is an antioxidant. So if you can be as rainbow colored as possible, that stands you in good stead, and I will explain why later. Specific food interventions would be something like phytoestrogen rich foods, or you might have heard of phytoestrogenic foods. And people often talk about things like organic soy products. So my line in the sand is I am absolutely fine with organic non-GMO soy milk if it's 100%, unsweetened, nothing else in there. Tofu, tempeh, things like fresh miso paste, absolutely fine, really like those. You can have a bit of 100% soy yogurt if you can find it without any binders and gums and stuff like that in it. There is a European brand called Sojade, S-O-J-A-D-E, which I'm fine with, but things like Alpro don't get the green light because they've got many other random things that we don't want. Flaxseed is a very interesting one, and you can use it as a therapeutic in a couple of different ways. So flaxseed oil, which I was going to mention later, but I might as well mention now, is a really good source of your phytoestrogens, but it's also about the fats it contains and the antioxidants. So for things like vaginal dryness, eye dryness that people might have, flaxseed oil is a great one to include there. So you could use that. It's very vulnerable to oxidation, so always keep it in a dark glass bottle in the freezer and just use it. Sort of take it from a spoon, mix it into something like yogurt, have it cold, don't ever cook with it. You could put it on something like salad leaves, but make sure that you're just using it and then putting it back in the freezer. If you use ground flaxseed, again, freshly ground, that can be a really good one for balancing hormone levels overall, because it binds to things like estrogen to help them come out through the body in terms of estrogen metabolites. So there are situations occasionally where the hormones they don't decrease at exactly the same rate. So people could be relatively progesterone dominant, say if they are particularly anxious. So then we would want to think about different balance things. So yes, flaxseed can be very helpful. Beans, lentils, pulses, whole grains, different vegetables, get all of those in. They're great for phytoestrogenic properties. To clarify, some people get a little bit confused. And I did have a question specifically relating to somebody whose sister had had an estrogen dominant cancer and had sadly passed away from it. And she was wondering, so she has chosen not to use HRT herself. She was wondering if phytoestrogenic foods are the same in terms of that potential, and they aren't. So a phytoestrogen looks like chemically our estrogen, but we aren't the same as plants. So what happens is they can bind to the receptors, but they don't have the same impact. So they can sort of mimic, but not to the same extent. So including them in your diet can help with management of symptoms, but it's not going to replace what you would endogenously, so naturally produces estrogen. So absolutely no concerns whatsoever about having good quality plant forms of the phytoestrogenic foods in your diet if there's any of that concern. And like I said, they can be quite useful in managing symptoms. Other bits that are really helpful are things like your fermented and your bitter foods, because they're going to help with liver function. Everything that gets broken down in the body goes to the liver. And one of the things that can happen with menopausal symptoms is, like I say, stress hormones can kind of bottleneck what else is going on, and that can lead to hormonal bits and pieces kind of fluctuating up and down, and all that other stuff. So yeah, look after your liver and also look after your gut, because that's really helpful for all this kind of stuff. Organ meats. I'm wondering if people are going to raise their hands here. In terms of bioavailable nutrition, again, when we're looking at the impact of heightened stress response through the menopause on overall health and well-being, we see a lessening of digestive efficacy. And this can mean that people feel bloated, they can get a little bit refluxy, they can actually start to compromise things like certain micronutrient status, things like their zinc and their iron, because minerals especially need to be changed by the strength of our stomach acid to be absorbed. So the reason I say organ meats is they are some of the most bioavailable sort of nutrient-dense foods that you can find. So you would always want to choose organic pasture-raised organ meats if you are going to have things like liver. And you don't have to just sit down and chow down on liver and onions if that's not your game. I personally couldn't do that. But next time you're making a bolognese, you could blitz them up with an onion in a food processor and then just cook it, and it would melt into the bolognese and you wouldn't notice it was there. Or put it into some meatballs, or you could make like a liver pate or something like that. So you don't need to eat loads, but if you were happy to include them, liver, kidneys, heart, they go great in slow cooker as stews. I don't know, but if you're happy to do it, they're a really valuable way of supporting the body when it's a little bit under pressure. The things that we can lessen to take burden off would be alcohol, caffeine, and isolated sugars. So all the things that make stuff great in life, not really. It's not a forever thing, but like I said, this idea of capacity for burden, alcohol and caffeine are things that will definitely impact liver function, but they also massively impact anxiety levels, and they will hugely impact sleep. So again, one of the things I'm going to talk about quite significantly in a second is sleep during the menopause, because it can be massively interrupted, and that impacts secondary things like brain fog, mental capacity, motivation to exercise, anxiety and depression levels, those kind of things. And what alcohol and caffeine do is they compromise your ability to settle into a proper sleep cycle overnight. And then what they also do is they encourage early waking. And we get the majority of our REM sleep, so our neurologically regenerating sleep, right at the end of our sleep cycle. So if you are then waking earlier in the night because you've had a glass of red wine to try and help you wind down, you might feel like you sort of fall asleep more quickly, but actually the sleep that you then get is of really bad quality, and you wake up feeling grotty and lacking in vitality, and that's not particularly good. Alcohol as well will also actually, and caffeine will play with blood sugar response. So you'll find that it will actually spike and then crash your blood sugar. And that can then lead to things like picking, grazing, sweet cravings, more of that central weight gain, worsening the insulin response, et cetera, et cetera. So what I tend to say is if you find that you're in a situation where those things are of a concern, these are easily modifiable factors that will benefit you. They don't have to be all the time, but if you say are used to having a glass of wine 2 or 3 nights a week, and you are seeing that this is actually becoming more of a problem for you, have a glass of wine on a Friday. Stick to 1 night a week, and then just let your body recover in between. If you're used to having 2 or 3 coffees a day, it might be that when you're going through perimenopausal and menopausal transition, you actually can't do caffeine at all, or maybe you need to go for something like matcha and have it with a little bit of collagen in it, and maybe have it alongside your breakfast rather than before, because what we don't want to do is wake up in the morning and before we've done anything, trigger our adrenal system to go into overdrive. There's also a notable thing here to say that alcohol and caffeine are significant bone mineral density wasting factors. They waste calcium. So again, one of the big concerns that we have when we start to lose our estrogen is what's going to happen to our bone density. And I will talk about that again in a second, but easily modifiable factor in terms of making sure that you aren't taking additional drains from your mineral reserves. The thing about isolated sugars, this could come for some women in the forms of obviously things like maple syrup, honey, coconut sugar, other bits like actual sort of sugar things like caster sugar or whatever it is. It could also be things like white flours, white breads, white pastas, white rices, some kinds of fruit like dried fruit. Depends on how reactive your system is at some point in time. I find that with some people who are struggling quite a lot, I get them to wear what's known as a continuous glucose monitor, which is something that you pop onto the back of your arm, and it's linked to an app on your phone, and it just shows it's your interstitial glucose response. It's not your blood glucose. So it's about 10 minutes after you've consumed a food and it's entered into your bloodstream, you then see the response on the CGM. But it would then show what your body is able to tolerate and how it's able to tolerate it. So some people, can't even do sweet potato because their body is just so sensitive at that point in time. But then when we take out caffeine and alcohol and get them sleeping better, they can then go back to including those things in. But I would just be aware if you are finding that you are quite anxious, or your mood keeps dropping, or you're finding that you've got quite significant mood swings, or your immune system's a little bit funky, or you're just feeling like you are going up and down all day, look at your carbohydrates. And if you are having anything that has a sweet flavor, and that, like I say, it could be a sweet potato, sweet flavor, and you're then crashing later in the day, it might be that that's just not suiting at this point in time. Or you need to preempt having that by having something like a really good protein source, whether that's, I don't know, having a boiled egg, or having some yogurt or some cottage cheese, or having your rice after you've consumed your chicken and veggies at dinner, that kind of thing. I'm going to move on a little bit, but there's quite a lot that can be said about that. And if you are in the UK and you're interested in the idea of a continuous glucose monitor, Freestyle Libre are the ones that I use. And if you go onto their website, you can try a 14-day free trial with that kind of stuff if you want to. Right. Okay. Getting into the nitty-gritty stuff. Hopefully we will carry on through. We've been talking for a long time already. So, right, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pick out top symptoms, and I'm going to talk about how we manage them. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of health concerns generally. So, quick fire round, here we go. Hot flushes and night sweats. So these are big ones. They tend to happen from a decrease in estrogen levels, and in response to a decrease in estrogen levels, your endocrine system actually releases more or other hormones that impact the hypothalamus, which is your brain's thermostat, and that then causes your temperature to fluctuate. If you are lucky not to have experienced a hot flush as of this point in your life, it's very difficult. And also, again, in the UK, if you've heard all this mad clamour about a man wearing a hot flush jacket and everyone getting really upset about it, it sort of feels like you're boiling from the inside and you can't cool yourself down. And it kind of just rises and rises and rises. And it can be quite embarrassing for women because it can happen anywhere. Yes, there is an element that stresses, sort of being in a situation where you feel uncomfortable, you feel anxious, will trigger that to happen a little bit more, but it can also happen at any point in the day. Many women find that it will specifically happen at nighttime. And this is because of the interplay between cortisol, naturally occurring cortisol, as an anti-inflammatory over the course of the day. And then when that drops at nighttime to let you go to sleep, it stops quelling that temperature control. So you then find that you get very hot. A couple of things that can be really helpful for managing this. You can use soaked coriander seeds Yes, you can. So just regular coriander seeds that you would buy as a culinary ingredient. Take a tablespoonful, lightly crush them with a spoon, put them into a little glass of water and let them soak for about 8 hours, and then just drain and sip that liquid. You can prepare that in advance, keep it in the fridge. But if you have a little bit of that, that can help to control hypothalamic fluctuations. That could be quite a good one. Sage is another one that works really well. You can either use sage tea bags or you can use fresh sage, and you would boil it in water with a lid on and then drink that over the course of the day. That can be quite helpful for regulating temperature fluctuations if you get them quite a lot. You can also buy things like sage tinctures and sage tablets, which again, if you're just getting them at night, you would just have them at nighttime. If you're finding that you're getting issues over the course of the day, you could use them multiple times, sort of like morning and evening. There are multiple things like Chinese herbs and adaptogens. So things like dongquai and black cohosh are quite well sort of talked about. You'll see them in menopausal complexes. In terms of using them sort of on their own, the thing about these sort of herbs is they are designed to be synergistic. So if you wanted something like that, I would use dongquai with black cohosh together. I'm not going to talk about dosages because they're, without knowing individual things about you, I can't tell you exactly how much to use. But if you want to do your research, they can be quite nice to use together. Red clover is an interesting one as well, and it does have a little bit more evidence of use on its own. It tends to improve things like general quality of life by managing hot flashes and night sweats. And this is the thing, when I said about just sort of looking at hormone fluctuations as the thing about menopause, it's not. The actual change in mental evolution is a big thing. So red clover can be an interesting one. One thing to flag here, though, it is an anticoagulant. So any issues with blood clotting or anything like that, you need to be cautious of using red clover. So just one thing. But then on the other side, as estrogen levels drop, we see an increase in cardiovascular disease risk. So it can be a benefit if you are looking at sort of managing blood pressure and that kind of stuff, and general viscosity of the blood, heart health, etc. Overall, liver support is important, which is what I was talking about with things like fermented and bitter foods. And then other things that, I mean, obviously the blood sugar regulation will help because that won't be going up and down and triggering it as a stressor. A couple of things that can be topically useful is you can split a duvet. So if you're sharing with a partner, have a large duvet case and either put 2 duvets in it next to each other, one of a lighter talk than the other, or have 2 separate duvets on the bed. You can also get cooling pillows, cooling gel packs, and cooling mattress toppers that you would put just on one side of the bed if you need that. I find that the gel mattress toppers work really nicely because although you aren't going to sort of get rid of that sense of heat, having something like a fan on you can be a bit noisy, it can be a bit disruptive, and it's better at sort of maintaining a cooler temperature for someone. Because also the other thing about getting hot at night is that's part of the reason that the menopause can disrupt sleep, because in order to fall asleep, your body temperature has to drop by a couple of degrees. And if that's not happening because you're getting very hot, then you might settle to sleep, but you won't actually get into a properly deep sleep. So that can help. You can also, it does work if you want it to, you can put your feet in cold water before you go to bed at night if you find that you get it quite badly, and just soak them in quite cold water because it's a really good way to regulate and cool body temperature. You can put kind of like damp, seasickness bands. I don't know if anyone's ever seen them with the little acupressure point. You can soak them or put them in the freezer and then pop them on your wrists. And they can be quite useful because, again, that's a really good point for regulating temperature, or put something on the back of the neck. The quietest fan that I found, which is something that I have researched for people, are the Dyson ones. They are the best ones to have close to a bed so they don't disrupt you or disrupt a partner. And if you're really struggling with disrupting somebody else, then give them some silicone earplugs, because if you're having terrible night sweats and they're trying to go to sleep and it's a problem, then silicone earplugs work quite well, as does a nice little silky eye mask. But yes, there are a couple of things. Okay, next one. Following on from that, fatigue and general sleep issues kind of transitions nicely. The reason that people struggle with sleep specifically, and a lot of kind of fatigue problems, is to do with progesterone being our natural sedative. So if progesterone has not, if our progesterone levels are lower, then we find that we might not have that trigger to settle to sleep, because this works alongside melatonin to help us actually fall asleep and then stay asleep. And obviously it can also be, your sleep can also be disrupted by the symptoms that I've just talked about before. If you're also struggling with things like a little bit of low mood, then that shows an impact on serotonin, which is converted into melatonin, which again compounds the situation. And so you can find that that's why you get the link of, well, actually, it's not even a link. It's sort of like a web, because if you get low mood, then poor sleep, then you get fatigue, which can then come back and create more low mood. So my other thing about this is to scan back to the idea of low stomach acid, because stress being an impact on that nutrient status. This is what I wanted to mention about things like cofactors for falling asleep. So make sure that your magnesium and your zinc status are absolutely optimal. You're going to be using those nutrients like nobody's business, because they go into all different things. Magnesium specifically is used everywhere in the body, from everything from muscular relaxation to liver detoxification to helping you produce your neurotransmitters. So I do very much use the Lipolife magnesium bisglycinate. And what I tend to do is I tend to give 3 doses per day. So it means that you're never looking for it. And so you then find that sort of anything like sleep issues and any low mood issues actually resolve. So I would give a teaspoon with breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And I find that works really nicely. I will at this point say that I have put together what we call the Menopack, which is a 4-pack of the 4 kind of top supplements that you might not have heard of in terms of menopausal support. And if you go to the Lipolife website and search Menopack, you can get them 15% off. So I'm going to touch on all the different elements of them. But the magnesium is definitely in there. The other ones that you could look at would be something like CBD oil, because CBD works on our endocannabinoid system. So it helps to modulate overall nervous system function, as well as the other things going on in the body. It can also help with things like regulating the hypothalamus, also helping with things like appetite regulation, all of that kind of stuff. So the brand I tend to use for that is Hyten, Hytn. And depending on how somebody is functioning, if it's purely that they need a bit of support at nighttime, I'd use the Relax oil before they go to bed. If they're a bit more anxious during the day, or they're struggling with things like brain fog, I might use one of the other oils like Focus or Rise and actually give it to them during the day. If somebody is really struggling, and insomnia with the menopause can very much be a thing, you might want to consider HRT, because like I say, progesterone is our natural sedative. Obviously start with all the other elements first if you would prefer to do that. But I do always like to open the conversation around HRT, because I believe that there's been years of fear around HRT, and that was all based on some quite badly misused clinical evidence. So it's based on the nurses study, and a lot of the statistical reporting was actually, in my opinion, kind of criminal in terms of the way it fearmongered around certain things. So there's a very interesting book called Estrogen Matters by Dr. Avram Blooming, and there's lots of different things about how a lot of that science has been disproven now, and HRT is incredibly advanced compared to where it used to be in terms of things like risks for cancers and that kind of stuff. Obviously, it's dependent on the individual person, but it is something to think about if you are really struggling. And if there is a significant impact on your quality of life, I think it's a conversation that you should think about having. So yes, and have a look at that book. Right, okay, so sticking with the nervous system for a little bit longer, brain fog and memory issues, obviously going to be compounded by the fact that somebody might be sleeping really poorly, but it's mainly triggered by the fact that we have huge amounts of estrogen receptors all over our body, and specifically on our nervous system tissue. So as that starts to fluctuate or decrease, we can then find that we become just a little bit foggy. We feel like we just don't have a hold on what we're doing anymore. It's that sort of alien sensation, feeling everything feels a bit surreal, you feel a bit detached. Again, that can impact mood, because my goodness, that's not a particularly nice way to feel. If you've been very capable, you've done all of your things that you've done throughout your daily life, and then all of a sudden, through no fault of your own, you just can't remember what you were doing, or you're in the middle of a sentence and the word's gone, and it's just not a particularly nice place to be. And that can be one of the primary things that I find in terms of supporting mood swings, is to get somebody feeling comfortable and capable in their own skin again. What we can then see is, obviously, if you've got a sudden drop in estrogen levels, you get a relative abundance of progesterone, and that can trigger quite significant anxiety. It's not that you are what we would call progesterone dominant. It's just if you imagine that your original levels of the 2 hormones were here, and estrogen is now falling and progesterone is maybe there, you've got a relative misplacement of the ratio. So for this, the thing that I find to be, or the things that I find to be most impactful, are your antioxidants. So CoQ10 is an incredible antioxidant, has wonderful properties in the body. People might hear of it more in terms of, if anyone's heard about things like statins, we know that statins impact CoQ10 production. So we think about, right, well, we have to take it with that. But actually, in terms of menopausal symptoms, CoQ10 taken at about a 400 to 800 milligram dosage for a month, depending on intensity of symptoms, shows a marked improvement in things like depression, anxiety, brain fog, and poor memory. So the LipoLife LLQ1 is a 200 milligram dosage. So again, what I tend to do is I tend to do multiple doses across the course of the day for the first month to get somebody back on their feet. And then we would decrease and see what their maintenance level requirement is. That is in the Menopack because of that, and then a couple of other reasons. My other favorite one is resveratrol, and there is a resveratrol in the LipoLife range. It's not in the Menopack, but it can be added on if you wanted to. Resveratrol is actually something, well, it's a multifaceted thing, which I'm going to talk about later as well, but it is what we call a nootropic. So it has positive impacts on cognitive function. And this is because it boosts something called BDNF. And BDNF stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And that basically means that it helps the brain to regenerate itself. It's also shown to increase cerebral circulation, which basically means you're getting more blood around the brain, which means you get more fresh glucose and energy to the brain cells, and you also get fresh oxygen. And it also prevents any kind of inflammatory damage to the nervous system, which is really important. And its big golden nugget here is it's clinically evidenced to attenuate the pressure created from stress. So if you can use something that actually limits the amount of impact a heightened stress response is going to have on your nervous system, then you're absolutely swinging. So I really like the LLR1 in combination with the CoQ10 if somebody is really struggling with brain fog and memory issues. It has to be a trans resveratrol supplement. If you aren't going to choose the LipoLife one, then you just need to make sure that you aren't being sold something that isn't going to be effective, because trans resveratrol is the form that is active, which is what the LLR1 is. A lot of supplements will not be trans resveratrol, which means they require conversion to be active. And like I say, if your body's already under pressure and you're then giving it something that has to then activate it, you're not going to get the same therapeutic dosage. And especially with antioxidants, you need really good stability to maintain their integrity, which is what a liposome offers. It's a little envelope that looks after it. But also it's about the bioavailability of the supplement. And a lot of antioxidants aren't particularly, well, actually stuff generally in capsules isn't going to be that bioavailable. You get about 45% of the stated dosage, whereas with the liposome, you get about 95%. So in terms of cost efficacy, you get much more bang for your buck when it comes to liposomal supplements if they are true liposomes and of good quality, like this range. Other three things to touch on here: vitamin D, which people might not know about or think about when it comes to the brain, but it actually preserves the structure of the brain. And there's a lot of interest now into vitamin D and neurodegeneration because it's actually shown at high dosages to help clear plaques from the brain, and sort of beta amyloid plaques, what we talk about when we think of things like Alzheimer's. So having a really good vitamin D level, and when I say good, I mean optimal, not functional, I mean optimal. So especially in a situation like this, you want to be about 90 nanomoles per liter or above to about 120. So if you haven't gotten any idea of what your vitamin D level is, then you could do an at-home blood spot test. You could ask your GP for a test if you were concerned, or you could do a private blood test and just find out where you're sitting at. We also know that obviously vitamin D is very important for bone health, which is why I'm going to talk about that in a second in a little bit more detail. But if you're hanging out anywhere near the 50 mark, that would still be classed as normal, but 50 is in the general sense, but 50 is the boundary that would then mark deficiency if you went below it. So if you're at 55, that's not good enough for me, I'm sorry. So you want to be much closer to those ranges that I mentioned. Omega-3 is also a very important thing to be aware of here, because they are, well, omega-3 fats are the structural and functional fats of the brain. So EPA is the more functional fat of the nervous system, and DHA is the more structural fat of the nervous system. As we get a little bit older, we obviously want to maintain structure and function, but compared to when we're a little bit younger, we need a little bit more of that DHA support. There is a liposomal omega-3 as part of the LipoLife range, which is beautiful, great absorption, great stability, because again, omega-3 can be very vulnerable to oxidation. So yes, it's a really lovely one for getting in there, and it's a vegan form as well, just in case people wanted to know. The other thing I always like to just note on here, similar to vitamin D, is cholesterol, because there's a lot of misinformation about cholesterol, which is slightly changing as we move forward into this century, but there's still, like I say, a little bit of confusion about what cholesterol actually does. It is incredibly important. You make 90% of your required cholesterol in your cells because it's that necessary for different parts of your body's functioning. Your entire nervous system and your brain are made of cholesterol. So as we get to the sort of postmenopausal era of life, people get very concerned about things like heart health because estrogen is incredibly important and protective of blood vessel integrity and the heart and cardiovascular system generally. So if somebody's got a slightly raised total cholesterol, and our boundary for raised cholesterol is literally so low now, it's kind of silly. But if somebody went up to about 6.5 and their ratio between forms of cholesterol was fine, I would be totally happy. If somebody came to me with a cholesterol of 7 and their LDL was through the roof, which is the less preferential form of cholesterol, and their HDL, which is the better form of cholesterol, is on the floor, I'd say, yes, we have a little bit of a problem. I wouldn't say you went on a statin, but I'd say that we have an issue there. Low cholesterol levels in later life are implicated in neurodegeneration. So all I want to say here is be aware of well-balanced cholesterol, so an equal or an aiming for a 1-to-1 ratio of LDL to HDL. It's kind of hard to achieve, but some people do it. But if you kind of went so that you're around that, HDL needs to be relatively equal or higher than LDL. That's kind of what we're looking at. And we're also looking at balanced blood glucose response because good quality cholesterol in the body does great things. Bad quality cholesterol in the body plus imbalanced blood sugar, kindling, spark. Imbalanced blood sugar not being an issue, no spark for the kindling. So just a way of kind of thinking about those kind of things and touching on bits that, again, might not be thought about in the great swathes of just thinking about hormonal fluctuation. Moving on. Musculoskeletal fun. So other things that women can tend to experience are things like aches and pains, feeling quite weak, sort of loss of muscle strength, collagen degradation, which could be things like losing elasticity within the skin, losing texture in the hair, finding their nails become a little bit brittle, all of the stuff that you just don't want to happen. So when you feel out of sorts and then you look in the mirror and you don't recognize the woman in front of you, always a fantastic way to make yourself feel good. So for aches and pains and bits and pieces like that, CoQ10 is incredibly important for cellular energy production within the muscles. And so again, absolutely fantastic here. Resveratrol, again, has been shown to improve pain perception and overall well-being in postmenopausal women. And like I say, it's also incredibly important for the bits I've said above. Carnosine is the exciting one here, and I absolutely love it. So I started using carnosine mainly with sports people because it binds to something called histidine in the muscles and means that you basically get more stamina. You can go for longer because it kind of prevents lactic acid buildup. However, when you look at the way that it impacts muscle structure away from sport, carnosine is shown to maintain muscular function and structure in the same way or a similar way as endurance exercise would do. And we know that as we get a little bit older, one of the things that gets hammered into us is this idea that we need to maintain our muscle mass and we need to maintain our bone density. So if you use carnosine on its own, it's going to have an impact, a positive benefit. However, if you then add on a little bit of resistance training on top, they work beautifully together and you get perfect maintenance of muscle mass and you get rid of those aches and pains and that kind of like lack of oomph. Magnesium is also incredibly important there because one of the reasons that women can get lots of aches and pains is because they're using magnesium in so many other places to do with these hormonal fluctuations in liver function that their muscle fibers physically can't unhook, because when you contract a muscle, you use calcium, and when you relax it, you use magnesium. And if there's not enough magnesium to go around, you prioritize things like liver function over relaxing your muscles, and that can cause stiffness and cramping and that kind of thing. So top ones there: carnosine, CoQ10, magnesium, resveratrol, bit of resistance training. Great stuff. Loss of muscle strength is basically down to the fact that you have estrogen receptors all over your muscle fibers. And one of the things that women probably don't talk about that much is incontinence, because it can happen and it's not particularly pleasant. If you are struggling with that kind of thing, I would send you straight to a pelvic health physio. There is absolutely no situation where you must cope with that, or you should assume that that's something you now have to deal with going forward in life. It is one of the primary markers of quality of life. Especially if you've had children, there will be obviously weakening of the pelvic floor if you've had a natural birth versus somebody who hasn't had a child that in a natural way. So I would just say that incontinence needs to be talked about more, and it's not about going and buying sort of incontinence pads or underwear that you kind of then just have to worry about. It's about thinking about how we can get that to be something that you don't deal with going forward. And there are fantastic women's health physios out there. So if anybody wants any more information about that, then you can always email afterwards and I can definitely send some info about that. But doing these things that I mentioned, like using the antioxidants, doing pelvic floor exercises, they will all help. And phytoestrogenic foods can support that, but again, they're not going to be quite the same. If you are, again, a note for the HRT side of things, with the genitourinary system, the environment of the genitourinary system is maintained by estrogen and progesterone, and the integrity of the lining of things like the vagina are maintained by those hormones. So if somebody finds that they are suffering with things like incontinence, perhaps interstitial cystitis, UTIs, thrush, it's because that environment is changing. And as the pH, so the acid or alkali balance of that environment evolves, you then don't get protection from things like bacteria as well. So you can use certain things like omega-7, which is, you can get it from sea buckthorn. You can also use things like pessaries that will help with maintaining, the natural pessaries that will help maintain the vaginal pH. Female probiotics can be helpful, either taken orally, or if you open a capsule, you can put it in sort of blood warm water, mix it up and then use it as a douche, and that can be helpful in sort of maintaining those microbial balances, which will also be protective. What you don't want to go down the route of is having to take multiple courses of antibiotics, because that will then obviously impact systemic well-being and things like gut health. D-mannose is another one that's very good at maintaining the environment and preventing UTIs, if that's something that you're suffering with kind of chronically. Many women will find that they get thrush and UTIs really badly for a couple of years or maybe a few months, and then all of a sudden they stop. So these are kind of things that you could put in prophylactically to then not have an issue, and then find that you actually don't need them ongoing in future. The reason I note on HRT is you can use HRT topically. So you wouldn't necessarily have to use sort of oral progesterone, topical estrogen patches or anything like that. You can get creams, and you can actually use progesterone capsules inserted within the vagina, and that can help with sort of supporting these and preventing them from being an issue. But it would depend on intensity of symptom as to what you required. But I just wanted to touch on those things because I think everybody needs to talk about them a little bit more. If we talk more about the, I guess, aesthetic things, so the collagen degradation, we all start to stop producing collagen effectively from when we're about 30. And so that will impact things like our skin, our hair, our nails, our muscles, our joints, our gut lining, all of that kind of stuff. So what we want to be aware of here is cofactors for collagen production. So that would be things like your vitamin C and your zinc. Within the Menopack, I've chosen to put in LVC1, which is the soy phospholipid liposomal vitamin C. Vitamin C is incredibly important generally for the body, but through the menopause, again, it's one of your primary antioxidants, and it's really useful for helping to break down stress hormones and that kind of thing in the liver, but also preserving things like skin integrity. So I would tend to combine a collagen supplement, and I would use a combined one. So something like the Motion Nutrition 50/50 bovine marine. If you don't eat meat, then you would just go for a marine one, something like the Bare Biology marine one, or the Hunter and Gather one. You can also get an isolated bovine. Obviously, if you don't consume any animal products, you wouldn't be able to use collagen because there isn't such thing as a vegan collagen, but you would just upregulate your cofactors for collagen production. So things like your zinc and your vitamin C. And then do the other bits that I was going to say, which is give your body cause to produce more collagen. So things like Botox, which some of my clients have chosen to use, and some of my compadres and friends and that kind of thing. Botox is the worst thing that you can do for maintaining your skin and your collagen integrity. Because say if we take the face, for example, your facial structure, you obviously have a skeleton of your face, and then you have muscles which attach to the facial skeleton by little hooks. And every time you move your face and you do things like this, you get the muscles to work. And that then gives them reason to regenerate and repair themselves. As you get a little bit older and you're not producing those elastic tissues as effectively, when you start to do this, you don't get the same response. However, if you then put in Botox, you paralyze the muscle, and then there's no pull on the bones whatsoever. So actually what you get is faster detachment of the muscle structure from the facial skeleton. And not only do you get more sagging over time, so then you need to get a filler or a lift, you actually start to get degradation of the bone density within the face as well. So please try and avoid that if you can. Something like microneedling, on the other hand, if you haven't heard of that, you basically have somebody who uses a very tiny little gun with tiny little millimeter fine needles that penetrate the skin. They cause micro damage to the facial surface. But what then happens is your body thinks, oh, trauma. We better flood that area with fresh collagen synthesis stuff. And all of a sudden you get a beautifully plump face. If you have deeper lines, you could do something like cosmetic acupuncture, which is tiny little needles that would go into the deep grooves around the jawline above here. And what that then does is it basically does a little bit of a lift. And it causes the muscles to plump up again. So they would be my suggestions. You can also do other bits and pieces with things like different kinds of light and that kind of thing, but that is not the conversation here. Hair texture, nail strength, all of that kind of thing. If you are going to be using collagen, you need at least 10 to 15 grams per day. Alongside your cofactors, and that will mean that you keep your luscious hair, beautifully plump face, and nice strong nails. And that's something that you can start using whenever. So if you start using it from when you're 30, by the time you get to your 50s, you won't need it quite as much because your body will have maintained it a little bit more. Okay, right, we are racing through this. So last bit, weight gain. This kind of sort of comes back to what I was talking about before. And I guess I wanted to sort of wrap with this because I think it's one of the things that can make sort of many women very uncomfortable. So it's due to this link between high stress hormones because of the hormonal fluctuations that are going on internally, causing a rise in insulin levels. Because insulin is what manages your blood glucose, and that has to be contained within a very narrow boundary. If you have cortisol present, so your stress hormone, because your body's going, what on earth is going on? You produce 3 times the amount of insulin than you would do if cortisol wasn't present. Don't know where my mind's going. Slightly different part of a female life cycle. So yes, if that's all going on, then your insulin levels go up. And what women can then find is that they will literally eat exactly what they've eaten forever. And then all of a sudden they start to put on weight. And that's then compounded by things like poor sleep, which means that you wake up in the morning with higher glucose levels than you would do if you'd slept well, and you crave carbohydrates in simple forms because you're really tired. And you also crave caffeine, which then drives your stress hormones up even more, which then means your insulin goes even higher. So I've talked a little bit about adapting the dietary stuff, but what I also really want to kind of come in from is the idea of how we exercise. So a lot of women will then, I will find, will sort of say, right, well, I need to do more exercise. And that's actually not what we want to do. The best thing that you can do is get your body to be calmer. So wake up in the morning, roll onto a yoga mat, spend 10 minutes, deep breathing and doing some stretches. Because the other thing that tends to happen is mental and physical self during the menopause, totally detached, because it's this idea that you just don't feel right anymore. And you're kind of seeing things. You're seeing a body that you don't recognize or feeling things in your body that you don't recognize. And it's really difficult to then keep those together. So if you can make sure that you start your day with your mind and your body connected and your adrenal system as calm as possible, you will then go forward and be much happier, and your insulin response will be sort of more controlled. And then you won't find that you put the weight on in the middle, and you won't crave the sweets and you won't crave the caffeine. Exercise wise, steady state, gentle exercise through the menopausal transition is really important, with small amounts of body weight, resistance band, or light resistance training. So resistance training is very important for bone health. And this is the same idea as the microneedling in the skin. It gives the skeleton cause to maintain its density. So anything that you do, like lifting a little bit of weight, creating a bit of a twist, jumping, rebounding on a little trampoline, that will encourage your bones to go, we're not going to be lazy. We're going to actually go and put more minerals into our bones, keep them nice and strong, all that kind of stuff. Vitamin D, magnesium, vitamin K2, really important for maintaining that as well. Calcium supplementation, somebody asked me about this. Calcium supplementation on its own, not particularly useful. Dietary calcium, so whether that's through really good quality dairy, whether you are more plant-based and you have things like tahini and edamame and green leafy vegetables, doesn't particularly matter, but it's more about supplementing the vitamin D with vitamin K2 and the magnesium. So depending on your vitamin D levels, within the LipoLife range, you can either go for the LVD2, which is isolated vitamin D, and then add LVK1, which is isolated vitamin K, because you might need additional vitamin D to get yourself up to a therapeutically relevant level with a little bit of K2. Or you can go for the LVD1, which is a combined vitamin D3 and vitamin K2, which would be a good one to use if you are just slightly bumping yourself up and then maintaining it. The reason I say you might separate them is if you're really low on your vitamin D, you would need to take quite a lot of the combined one, and that actually might mean that you're slightly overdoing it in terms of the K. But that's hopefully a little bit helpful. But yes, coming back to the exercise, what you want to be doing is thinking about ways that you can regularly move your body without overstressing it. So HIIT training needs to die a very quick death, and that's not something you want to be doing. Think about something like going for a really nice walk once you're awake. So if you find that you're struggling with vitality in the morning, don't push yourself to go out and do something first thing that's really intense, because you're just going to require your stress hormones to fill in the gap that your energy doesn't have yet. So that then compounds the issue over time. So wake up a little bit gently at home, like I say, do a bit of breathing, do a bit of stretching, maybe have something like a nice cup of herbal tea rather than a coffee. You could go for a coffee replacement like a dandelion coffee or a turmeric latte or something like that. Maybe use medicinal mushrooms because they're great for modulating the nervous system response. I'd love to talk about them, but I think I'm running out of time. And then yes, try something like a good steady state walk. You could put something like weights on your wrists and stride. So you did a little bit of a cardiovascular workout. And make it so it's a level that we could have a nice chat, but you wouldn't be able to sing. So that's plenty of exercise. And that's a really good way to get your body moving, keep your metabolism balanced. You find you don't overtrigger your hunger signaling. You'll eat in a much better managed way. You'll make good food choices and your body is still active and you are getting a bit of resistance training. You could also go for a swim. If you wanted to, you could go for a nice cycle. If you are sort of a competent cyclist and it was more of I'm not talking sort of like a 4 to 5 hour endurance cycle. I'm talking more about going out on your bike or going to a gym and going on a static bike. You can challenge yourself. It's not about not challenging yourself, but you would do it in measured blocks. So I wouldn't want to see anybody peaking their heart rate for longer than 20 to 60 seconds at a time. So it might be that they say did some weight training, but it was body weight training, or it was sort of resistance bands, like I say, or they're using light weights, but kind of higher reps. And they would do something like 3 sets of those. And then they might use a skipping rope for that rebounding training for 60 seconds. And then they would have a break and then they'd do it again. And they would do their skipping again. Or you could do a little jog on a treadmill, but for like a minute or two, and then you would come off again. Anything that is going to be a real push on your body, it's just adding to that load that you've got on your back, and that then whacks everything up. And yeah, you get the opposite of what you want. And that's when the muffin top comes in. Muffin top and bits around the thighs are where we refer to this as the cortisol spare tire. It's a really horrible thing. People sort of call it the muffin top, but it's if you imagine it as if you were putting on weight everywhere, that would show that you were exceeding your body's energy requirements and you were just, getting bigger. If you put it all in one place, it's a response to stress because your body is basically putting it there just in case. So it has no idea. Your brain is just a control center in a black box. It can't tell that the risk signal it's getting is because of hormonal fluctuation. It could be famine or drought or something like that. So it deposits fat in one place. So should that be the cause, famine be the cause, it can then go and get that energy in one quick swoop and doesn't have to go and look for it on your left leg and your right arm and that kind of stuff. So that's what you've got, and you're exercising quite a bit or you're not sleeping particularly well, concentrate on those things and you'll find that that starts to go away. And it will be something that progressively, once you have finished the transition, can help. If you are really struggling with it, again, HRT is something to be spoken about there because it can be related specifically to low estrogen. I probably will wrap with this. The last thing that I wanted to talk about was fasting, because it's something that goes from being completely contraindicated to being something that could be quite good for longevity going forward. So when you are going through the menopausal transition, fasting is the worst thing you possibly do, because again, it's another stressor on the body and you will be hungry and you will be tired and your blood sugar will not respond positively, and it's generally not a particularly kind thing to do. However, postmenopausally, we can then relate a lot of the studies that are done on men to women because we're no longer cycling, so our metabolism behaves quite similarly. And actually, whilst I'm talking about men, when I've talked about HRT, I've related it to progesterone and estrogen, but I haven't mentioned testosterone. If you are on HRT, and you feel like you aren't getting the benefits that you should be doing, do speak to whoever your prescribing physician is about testosterone. Can really help with things like muscular power, maintaining muscle mass, and memory. So I will leave it at that. But yes, when you get past and into the postmenopausal transition, for things like longevity, brain health, heart health, fasting, so intermittent fasting, can be really useful. It's shown to preserve things like DNA integrity, and that would be having a relatively early dinner, fasting for about 16 hours overnight, and then breaking your fast mid-morning with a really good quality protein and colourful veggie-rich brunch lunch, and then trying to leave a nice gap between that meal and your next meal, and then a nice gap between that meal and your evening meal, and onwards you go, because every time you leave a gap, your insulin falls, your body has its opportunity to regenerate, and especially overnight, it basically takes out all of its garbage, regenerates your DNA, repairs it without distraction, and that's absolutely fabulous. If you are sort of going through the menopause, you can mimic that benefit by having really good quality protein, non-starchy veg, complex carbs, a little bit of fat, and then leaving a gap between your meals. And this is not about denying hunger. This is about making sure that your meals are well balanced enough to be sustaining, that you then get those benefits going forward. Because I have literally 30 seconds left, whilst we're talking about longevity, a couple of very interesting things as well to note within the LipoLife range, because they are very good at this, is to look at things like the nucleotide complex, the NMN. There's another nucleotide product. So they basically protect DNA replication, because they are the little building blocks that you make DNA out of. And as we get older, one of the things that tends to happen is we lose efficiency within our body's machine, because it's been doing the same thing for years. And that's why it sort of starts, it's the same thing as a car. It starts to get a little bit less efficient. So adding in nucleotides is shown to be incredibly beneficial for maintaining optimal health into the long term. Resveratrol is another one that is lumped in with that group, as is quercetin, and there is a beautiful quercetin and bromelain within the range, and a few other bits and pieces. Things like the CoQ10 would also land itself in there. I did also forget one more thing about carnosine, and actually I was going to mention potassium iodide. So carnosine is also related to blood glucose and insulin sensitivity. So within all the stuff that I was talking about with the weight gain and balancing that, carnosine is also very useful at mitigating that problem. And bone density wise, the one thing that we sometimes don't talk about is iodine. So there is a potassium iodide in the range, which you might have a look at, unless you eat things like lots of sea vegetables, which some people do, some people don't. So seaweeds are very rich in iodine naturally, so you might get it from there. But the other note in terms of metabolic balance, metabolism, one of those two, is that during the menopause, because of the stress on the body and the link to the hypothalamus, which is that brain's thermostat, but also kind of like an all-seeing eye for your brain and your endocrine system, some women can find that they get slightly low thyroid function, so hypothyroidism. Not sort of long-term, but it can just be that the thyroid levels drop a little bit. And iodine is one of the cofactor nutrients that's integral for the reduction of thyroid hormones. And on that, I shall take a very deep breath. And if you have any questions, chuck them in the box and I will answer them. I think I have touched on everything else that people had asked. And I hope that you enjoyed this. And yes, any questions, chuck them out there. And I will wait for a couple of minutes. And if not, then we will end the session. And I will wish you all lovely evenings, days, wherever you are. So yes. This is that point when no one asks a question and I go, oh, maybe I've covered it all. Okay. Oh, got one. I'm so glad that you enjoyed it. That's brilliant. Why would I go for a vitamin that has a flavor included as opposed to vitamins that do not? So within the LipoLife range, you will see that some of them contain flavors and some of them don't. In most cases, there is an unflavored option, and it's entirely down to personal preference. There are a couple. For example, LLT2 is a beautiful curcumin, boswellia, and hydroxytyrosol complex, and hydroxytyrosol are the anti-inflammatory nutrients you get from olive oil, that group of things. Boswellia tastes horrendous. So there is just an element that it wouldn't be a palatable thing to have. There are a couple of as well that you would just need to check the dosages. So for example, the glutathione, there's LLG4, which is the therapeutic level glutathione, but glutathione, like resveratrol, is a sulfur-containing compound, so it does have a slight sulfury taste to it, so it's just to be aware of that. The other glutathione product that is flavored is the LLG3, and that's a slightly lower dose. So just be aware that depending on which one you're looking at, the flavors might be there reflecting just the fact that something doesn't taste particularly nice, or it might be that they're actually changing the dosage. Fab Talk, thanks. Is carnosine okay in Hashimoto's? Absolutely. It would be something that actually be very useful if you've got Hashimoto's. And the brilliant thing about using liposomals when you've got an autoimmune issue is that you don't have to worry about interactions, like negative interactions with other excipients and stuff, which can happen. So brilliant. Hair loss. Hair loss during menopausal transition can be something it's just called hair drop, which is due to a change in hormonal levels. The thing that seems to help quite a lot with that is making sure that your vitamin D status is optimal. Also, it's looking at that stress response in terms of micronutrient sort of uptakes, your minerals. So magnesium, zinc, vitamin C is incredibly important. And potentially also looking at something like the carnosine, because that's going to be related to what else is going on with those kind of like connective tissue style structures. Saffron working for mood swings. Absolutely. Saffron it's got quite a lot of evidence for being good for anxiety. It's not so great for mood swings. If I was going to go down that kind of route, then I would be looking probably more into adaptogenic stuff, whether that was medicinal mushrooms, ashwagandha, that kind of thing. Like I say, saffron, sorry, 1 second. Saffron is more anxiety, like an anti-anxiety situation. It works quite nicely for sleep. So I do sometimes use saffron in a culinary sense, like actual pieces of saffron. If you steep that in water, and then you would drink that alongside having something like magnesium at bedtime, maybe some CBD. So that would be probably my combination. Does the menopause end? It does indeed. And it's kind of like a glorious phoenix rising from the ashes. No, not really. It does end. And for a lot of women, it's not so much like a rebirthing situation, but they do kind of come out feeling quite different. I think the thing that I always like to make women very aware of is that there is absolutely no situation where you have to cope or deal with menopausal symptoms. So things like the brain fog, it's debilitating, and not sleeping is not a tenable thing to have going on. So there are all of these options at our fingertips, and actually many women again I think it might just be a thing as being a female, we can be a little bit bad at investing in ourselves. We will look after everyone else, but we sometimes forget that in order to be able to do that, we need to be the one who is cared for too. So taking a step back from that and just making sure that you are inputting a lot of these things will mean that something that maybe currently feels quite difficult can be significantly easier. And whether that is going and having an acupuncture session once a month, or taking 20 minutes at the end of the day or the beginning of the day to do a little bit of yoga, or go for a walk on your own, or I don't know, anything like that, go and have, I don't know, a latte somewhere by yourself and read a book, or those kind of little things that just make you feel like you are important. It's about taking that ownership back in a situation where you kind of don't have a lot of control over what's going on internally. But yes, it does end. To summarize. Is carnosine the same thing as L-carnitine? No, they are completely different. Acetyl L-carnitine is a different amino acid. So it's useful. It's again to do with energy metabolism. They're not the same thing. Any more questions? Oh, my pleasure. How to obtain the basket with a discount. So if you go onto the Lipolife website, so just go lipolife.co.uk, type in the search bar, Menopack, MENOPACK, it will come up, and the discount is automatically applied. So it should be on there at 15% off as a standard thing. So you can get the carnosine, CoQ10, vitamin C with the soy phospholipid and the magnesium. And the reason the soy phospholipid is there, if you would prefer not to use the soy phospholipid, you can use the LVC2, that's the sunflower phospholipid one. The reason I chose the soy phospholipid specifically, they're the same dose, the LVC1 and the LVC2, soy and sunflower, is because it has the phytoestrogenic property, but it's also very good for the cardiovascular system, so it's blood pressure related. The LVC2 is the one in the sunflower, and that's more, it's higher in choline, so it's more about nervous system support. But in this situation, I use the LVC1. Yes, you can get it in the EU. They ship internationally, so that's not a problem at all. Just realized I've spoken for about an hour without having any water, and my voice is rather hoarse. Right. Is the recording available? There is a lot to take in. And absolutely. When I finish this, it's going to be saved and then distributed to everybody who signed up. So you will automatically get the recording because you are registered, and everybody who didn't make it this evening will also get it as well. So yes, I'm glad that there was a lot. I know there was a lot, but hopefully it's one of those things that will sit and permeate and digest over time. Can you take too much magnesium? Pretty much no. So if somebody was literally drinking magnesium citrate powder, they could give themselves an upset stomach. But in this sense, the magnesium, the liposomal magnesium is bisglycinate form. With the way that our bodies work in modern life and the fact that our soils are pretty depleted in things like magnesium, we will never take in enough to meet our requirement or really go over the top of it. And in the liposomal form, you're going to absorb it and take it in systemically. So it will go to, like I say, the brain, the liver, the nervous system, the digestion, all that kind of stuff, and you won't get any negative impacts. If somebody had very, 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 very low blood pressure or very, very low sodium, they could find that if they literally took 10 times the dose that they were supposed to be taking, they could feel a bit lightheaded. But I'm talking significant quantities, and I highly doubt that anybody you wouldn't achieve that with taking, say, 3 to 7 doses of the LLM1 per day. So that would be absolutely fine. Which collagen, bare biology or motion nutrition, or either? So the reason I would go priority motion nutrition is because what you're looking for is structural support from the bovine, so the 1 and 3 type collagens. That's going to be joint, gut, like big structures, bones, that kind of stuff. And then the marine collagen is more the finer structures, so hair, skin, nails. But because you're looking at overall support, if you use the motion nutrition one, you don't split the difference. If you just use marine collagen, you might start to try and eke it for somewhere else. So I would say go for the motion nutrition one, and then you will make sure that you get the best results from that. And I think the serving size gives you the standard 10-gram therapeutic dose. If you were in a situation where you were finding like your hair was like really falling out or breaking, or your skin was very dry, or you were getting quite a lot of like muscle wastage, then I would go up to 15 grams per day for a short course, about 2 to 3 weeks, and then go down to 10 grams just to fill in the gap a little bit more quickly. And the great thing about collagen is it will just dissipate into anything. So whether that is water, herbal tea, yogurt, broth, whatever it is, it will just disappear. So yeah, I would personally go motion nutrition. I also find the bare biology one a little bit fishy. If you just want a marine one, I'd actually probably go for the hunter and gather marine one over the bare biology, just out of personal preference. I think that the flavor is different. Do you know of cases of people who have developed RA being rheumatoid arthritis during menopause? In my case, I had Hashimoto's before, and what do you think of bioidentical hormones? So in terms of developing RA during menopause, if you've already got one autoimmune condition, then you're at 30% higher likelihood of developing another one at some point in your life. And we know that autoimmunity is very much triggered and then mediated by stress. So yes, you can find that the appearance of a second autoimmune condition could have happened during the menopause. It might have been triggered by it, or it might just been a compounding of cumulative factors over time. Also, the immune system goes a little bit haywire with all of this other stuff going on, especially with cortisol doing its merry dance and things like antioxidant capacity being slightly lowered. Bioidentical hormones, it depends on who is prescribing them. For example, if you were to go to a GP and they prescribed you something like estrogel and utrogestan, they are bioidentical. They are synthetic bioidentical hormones. The thing about actual BHRT is it's not as regulated as the stuff that you would get that is more kind of sort of like pharmacological. So I think there's definitely a place for them. I think if you see a very good practitioner who does BHRT, then that's absolutely fantastic. And there are many of them, but people get confused that like the stuff that you would get from your GP isn't bioidentical. It very much is. It's just depends on who you would see. And also certain endocrinologists will use things like the HEA as well as estrogen, progesterone and testosterone. Testosterone here, actually in the UK, we don't have it as a licensed thing for HRT. So it would come as sort of like a male testosterone or like a non-assigned one. But we do use it a lot more, and you can get it as creams and bits and pieces now. Do you have any concerns about collagen feeding cancer cells? No, absolutely not. Definitely not. That is not something that is in any way factually correct. There is, yeah, so you'd be absolutely fine with that. Obviously, if you are somebody who is undergoing treatment for cancer, then you would not add anything into your routine without checking with your oncology team first. But you wouldn't need to be worried about that. Any more for any more? Going once, going twice. Okay, I think at that stage, we will call it quits. Thank you all for joining. Thank you for your fantastic questions, and have a lovely rest of your day/evening. Bye for now.